photography of burning of the Talmud, Paris, 1242. In order to appreciate the significance of the event that we are discussing tonight, which is the burning of the Talmud, one has to first appreciate the significance of the Talmud itself. What is the Talmud? So, again, for those who have the lecture outline, it says at the top, intro, importance of Talmud, which is Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Torah Sheba'al Peh is the indispensable companion to the Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah. The Torah, the 5 books of the Torah, the other books of the Tanakh, the Nevi'im and the Ksuvim, this represents for us the basis of our faith and the basis of our understanding of the revealed will of God. But it is not the entirety of it. There is also the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is, as I said, the indispensable companion, without which the Torah itself is inadequate and subject to misinterpretation, sometimes inadvertent, sometimes willful. The Talmud has therefore been the target of opposition by many groups in the course of our history. And actually, from the earliest time even, from the days of the Mishnah and the Talmud itself, we find that the Talmud has been denounced by our adversaries. So it was opposed by the Sadducees, the Tzedokim, the Samaritans, the Shomronim, the Karaites at a later time as well. And those groups have in common a rejection of the authority of the sages, of the Chachamim, and the authenticity of the Torah Sheba'al Peh itself. And in that sense, the Christians were merely following in an established and ignominious trend of those who seek to denounce the Talmud. And we'll soon see the importance of that position and the reason for it. You see, the Talmud really represents the crux of the difference between Judaism and its daughter religions, Christianity and Islam. Christianity and Islam share with the Jewish people a reverence for the Torah Shebiksav, a veneration of it, a recognition of its divine origins, albeit immediately there are important differences there as well. I wouldn't equate the Christian belief and that of the Muslims, lahabdu, with our belief as well. But nevertheless, there's no question that those religions have developed from Judaism itself. But where they part company is with the Torah Sheba'al Peh, with the existence of the oral Torah. And this is obviously the case because Christianity has allegorized so much that it says in the Torah itself. So it's quite clear that they cannot understand the Torah the way we understand it, because if so, they would be circumcising their boys, they would be adhering to the dietary laws, they would be celebrating the Sabbath as we do on Shabbos, etc. So, and of course they do it in a completely different way. So it's quite obvious that they part company with Judaism and the Muslims as well, although Islam draws from the Talmud liberally, but at the same time, Islam cannot accept the authority of the Talmud, because if so, then they would essentially be accepting the totality of Jewish tradition, which of course they do not. And I'm not even getting into contemporary politics, but just at the level of the difference between our understanding of Torah and that which is espoused by these other faiths. The Talmud has been the target for Enlightenment ideologues as well, because the Talmud was seen as establishing the power and the authority of the Chachamim, of the sages, and of the rabbis as well. And because the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire and all of his associates, they were seeking to undermine the power of the church, and by extension, the power of the church was seen to inhere within the original Jewish tradition of the Torah and its interpretation. Moreover, the Talmud represents the basis of the authority of the Rabbanim, and therefore, when the Haskalah got underway, of course, the Talmud was completely unacceptable to them. And even today, the Talmud remains the object of virulent anti-Semitism. If you want to inflict some grief upon yourself, you can Google Talmud and you'll see that you get a vast, odious parade of the most hateful, wretched anti-Semitism, Stormfront, and many others like that. And so the Talmud has been a target for opprobrium really from its inception and even until today. Moreover, and I've put in parentheses because it's a slight diversion from our topic, but it's also rejected by Reform. And I've often thought to myself of the irony of Reform rabbis who quote the Talmud, but they do so selectively, taking what suits them and ignoring whatever does not. So this, pick and choose approach to the Talmud is tantamount to rejecting its authority as well. We don't have time right now to understand fully what is the Talmud and its origins and its significance, but I hope we've indicated at least that it is essential to the practice of Judaism as we know it today and has been for 2,000 years. The Talmud is complex, it is nuanced, and it contains many Aggadic passages which are not to be understood simplistically and literally. Agadah, for those who are not familiar with the expression, refers to those narrative parts of the Talmud that interprets the verses of the Torah often in a kind of fantastic way, in a way which is almost mythological. The so-called legends of the Talmud and midrashic passages, this is all sort of subsumed under the designation Agadah. And many of those passages, and we'll have a chance to consider some of them, are indeed very striking and apparently defy any rational understanding and could lead the reader to think that this is somehow a kind of compendium of fables or myths for the amusement of children or people of limited intelligence. In fact, of course, that is the means by which the Talmud masks philosophical teachings, other forms of teaching, sometimes ethical teachings, and others. But nevertheless, the existence of those kinds of passages has thrown many people off the scent, so to speak, and has given the impression that the Talmud is, as I said, full of maybe mythology or fantastic statements which are very far removed from religious conviction and inspiration. Again, it has to be understood in its context and in a more sophisticated way. But of course, as we will soon see, some of those passages served as a pretext for the attack on the Talmud itself. Also, the halachic pronouncements of the Talmud, many of them are disputed or limited by time and place. So if a person were to extract a passage from the Talmud, even in a halachic vein, that statement may or may not be upheld in the final analysis. That statement may or may not be applicable, let's say, in a wider context. And therefore it's easy to, especially if a person has the intent to do so, it's easy to distort and to maybe even expose the Talmud to ridicule. And this is why we need the commentaries in every generation. In sum, for 2,000 years, Judaism has been based on the Talmud, and therefore an attack on the Talmud is an attack on Judaism itself. So this is the basis for our now approaching our subject, which is a fascinating and tragic chapter in European Jewish history, in particular the history of the Jews of France, with implications, as I said, for all of Judaism itself. The first personality that we should mention is Nicholas Donin. Nicholas Donin was a Jewish man. He was a student of the yeshiva in Paris. How far he got in his studies is unclear. I don't say he was a Talmud Chacham, but neither was he a complete ignoramus either. In 1225, he was excommunicated by Rabbi Rashi Paris. Rabbi Rashi Paris was the Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva in Paris. He was the leading rabbinic personality in Paris at that time, and he put this Nicholas Donin in cherem. And the reason he put him in cherem is that he was making fun of the words of the sages, and he doubted the authority or the authenticity or the validity of the Torah Shebaal Peh. And after having been rebuked and reprimanded, he was excommunicated. Now, to be put into cherem in medieval times, even until modern times, just about, was an almost untenable situation. It's not like today where it's essentially almost a mockery. It's very difficult, if possible at all, for a writ of cherem to have any significant impact. In earlier times, that was not the case. A Jew could only live within the Jewish community. If he was put into cherem, if he was excommunicated, which means that people would not do business with him, depending on the terms of the cherem, they might not be allowed to talk to him, they might not even be able to approach within 4 amos, about 6 feet of that person. They could not count him in a minyan. Worse, if he made a bracha, you're not allowed to answer amen to his bracha. You could not interact with him. Such a person was completely ostracized from society. And there was no other society in which he could live. Because in Christian Europe, either you're a Christian or you're a Jew. And if the Jews, so to speak, rebuffed him, then where could he go? And I'm not trying to defend him. I'm just indicating that his circumstances were untenable. Apparently he clung to some kind of association with Judaism for a number of years, but around the year 1235, he submitted to baptism. And he joined the Franciscan order. It seems that he was specifically recruited by the Christian missionaries. They saw in him a prize. He was a Jew who was at least somewhat knowledgeable. As we'll soon see, he was very industrious. He was a person of great apparent drive, and he was greatly embittered against his erstwhile co-religionists. And therefore they recognized that in this Nicholas Donen they could have a real tachshit, as we might say, in an ironic way. And he became a very eager and enthusiastic follower of Catholicism. And his first act of vengeance against his erstwhile co-religionists was he stirred up the Crusaders in these various towns, and the Crusaders were never far from massacring a few hundred Jews at a convenient opportunity. And over the course of a number of weeks or months, there were 3,000 Jewish casualties, 3,000 dead, and apparently, according to the evidence, a further 500 who accepted baptism to save their lives. Whether they remained that way or not is unclear. And in any case, these figures, although the best ones that we have, they may well have been exaggerated or inflated, but it is apparent that his agitation against the Jews already had a strong and tragic impact. But that wasn't enough for him. He took himself off to Rome in 1236, and there he sought an audience with the Pope. Pope Gregory received him favorably, and to Pope Gregory he presented a list of 35 allegations against the Talmud. And he said to the Pope that the Talmud is really the source of all of this blasphemy, all of this heresy, and he alleged among the 35 allegations as follows. He said that the Talmud distorts the meaning of biblical passages, and that there's a verse that you might read in the Bible which has a meaning which is apparently clear enough, and you look in the Talmud and there it's completely distorted, completely interpreted in some fanciful way, and this is a terrible violence that the Jews have done to the Holy Scriptures. Now I put here in parentheses for those who are following the outline, there's signage outside of Kesher, not immediately outside, don't get me wrong, but just down the road at the bus shelter. I wonder if anybody has noticed it. Yeah, did you notice it? It says Isaiah 53 will change your life. Go to this website and we'll show you Isaiah 53 and it will do great things for you. Now, it's just ironic that after I had already scheduled this year, they just put up that sign. And it's no coincidence that they've put it here in a Jewish neighborhood. I mean, whether they would put it in, Stoke Newington or I mean to say, Tower Hamlets, I don't know. If Stoke Newington, maybe they would. That is a chapter in Isaiah which, according to the Christian interpretation, I don't even want to use the word prove, but that's what they would say, the validity and the sort of prophecy regarding Oso Ha'ish, Jesus, the founder of Christianity. And if you crack open the Tanakh and you take a look at that chapter, if you read it with an open mind, you can see how they indeed, were able to find some evidence, although it was all ex post facto, for the founder of Christianity. But the point is, of course, that our tradition completely dispenses with any such interpretation. And the same can be said for many other verses in the Torah, which they interpret in their way and we interpret in our way. I just took this off my shelf just before I came here earlier. There's a little booklet here called The Real Messiah, A Jewish Response to Missionaries. That's a fascinating book written by Aryeh Kaplan years ago, and it makes it fascinating to read. Anyone who has an interest in the subject and anyone who knows someone, a Jewish person who possibly is interested or even swayed by the arguments of missionaries, might find this very useful. I just pass that around. And there is a comment here about Isaiah 53 as well. Actually, though, the subject the example that he gave, that Nicholas Donin gave, is that it says in the Torah that one who gives his sons to Molech, who gives of his sons to Molech, should be put to death. Molech was a fire god, and it was a form of pagan idolatry, a particularly execrable form which involved child sacrifice. And the Torah says that one who gives of his sons to the Molech shall be put to death. But in the Gemara, it interprets it that only if he gives of his sons, let's say he's got 5 children, and he gives 2 or 3 of them to the Molech, then he's put to death. But he gives them all, then he's not put to death. And this is a drash that's mentioned in the Gemara. So this was held up to ridicule. Here you have a verse which makes good sense, and the rabbis are coming and saying, well, that's only if you give 1 or 2, but if you give them all, so then you're not put to death. So that's an example of how the Talmud distorts the biblical passages. The Agadah teaches unworthy conceptions of God. Now, I want to just elaborate a little bit on this because there will be an important echo later on towards the end of our discussion this evening. And that is that we find in the Agadah some anthropomorphisms, some references to Hashem that appear to give human form to God. Now, that idea of the anthropomorphisms, the attributing human qualities to Hashem, was in fact greatly disputed by the Jewish sages as well. And the philosophers sort of wrangled with their critics over these kinds of passages, when the philosophers sought to allegorize statements that were objectionable because it seemed to attribute human faculties to God. And we'll see towards the end of our discussion tonight how this is, there's an important echo of this. Letter C, for those who are still following, within capital B, number 5, that despite these deficiencies, the Talmud is valued by the rabbis above the Bible itself. Now, I wouldn't say that this is exactly so, that it's valued more than the Torah, but of course it is, as we keep saying, the indispensable companion to the Torah itself. He alleged that it blasphemes Jesus and Mary. And then finally on our list here, these are only selections of the 35, but also that the Talmud is that which especially keeps the Jews obstinate in their perfidy. Now, this, in a way, my friends, is the most important of all of them. And I must elaborate a little bit because many historians of this period don't appreciate the magnitude of this objection. You see, he was probably right that it is the Talmud, it's the Torah Shebaal Peh, which is the lifeblood of the Jewish people, and which has kept the Jewish people faithful in their beliefs, and has caused them to reject outright the Christian claims. But you see, the Christians in medieval times, and up till this very day, in some cases, actually believe that they can't understand, they are genuinely baffled by the fact that the Jews do not accept the truth of Christianity. They are genuinely unable to understand how it is that we are blind to the truth of all of their great proofs. Now, from our point of view, of course, the matter is almost laughable. It might be laughable if it weren't so tragic in its implications. But the fact is that they believed that the Jews really know the truth, and they really recognize the truth. but in their perfidy, in their blindness, in their willful wickedness, because they've been co-opted by the devil himself, they refuse to acknowledge it. And this helps explain the almost hysterical preoccupation with persecution of the Jews among the medieval Christians, because the existence of the Jews gave the continued lie to Christianity. And that's why we have the claims of the desecration of the host and many other things, because they believed that we also accept Christianity, but there is something within the Jewish people which is preventing them from acknowledging the truth. And they latched upon the Talmud, and in this sense, they were probably absolutely right, as serving as the basis for why we completely reject the Christian claims. And for that reason, probably more than any of the others, Pope Gregory was very receptive to these claims, and he decided to introduce a kind of inquisition against the Talmud. So Gregory wrote letters appealing to the monarchs of Spain, Portugal, England, and France to confiscate and investigate the Talmud. It was a form of an inquisition, as I said, to root out heresy and heretics. And even though we normally associate the Inquisition with Portugal and Spain, but actually in Iberia, the Inquisition was only established 200 years later. This was a much earlier form of the Inquisition, as I said, that was focused against sources of heresy. And they rooted out heresy within the Christian religion. And of course, the Talmud was seen as a repository also of a form of heresy. And as we mentioned a moment ago, they felt that if it were not for the Talmud, the Jewish people themselves would have embraced Christianity long ago. Well, unfortunately for Greg, things didn't work out for him quite as he had imagined. The kings of Spain, England, Portugal, they didn't seem to take any interest in his letters. But he put special emphasis on France. And he wrote a personal letter to King Louis of France. Now, King Louis IX was born in 1214. He was a young man still at this time. He was only maybe in his early 20s, but he was a very, very religious man. We would say fanatic Christian, certainly very eager to please the Pope, and as we will see, very quick to condemn the Jews in his realm. By the way, he later became known as St. Louis. So if you've heard of St. Louis, then this is St. Louis, this is him. And he was the only one to take up the call. France at that time, unlike maybe subsequent centuries, but then it was the world center of Talmudic scholarship. Remember Rashi, my namesake, I can't let a year go by without mentioning Rashi, was in France. Rashi was a Frenchman. And the Balei Tosafos were mostly Frenchmen. Rabbeinu Tam in Rameru, which Yehuda visited him a few weeks ago. In Rameru, which is today just a small village, but that was where Rabbeinu Tam lived. Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, maybe the first and the greatest of the Balei Tosafos. And many other great Balei Tosafos lived in France, and Rabbi Yechiel Paris himself was again one of the great Balei Tosafot, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva in Paris. And therefore, the Pope realized that if he could get the French authorities on his side, this would deal a devastating blow to the Jewish people. And I'm sorry to say that v'chein have, that's exactly what happened. Turn the page over, and we see how he took up the cause. So King Louis appointed a committee of churchmen so they confiscated many volumes of the Talmud, and they subjected it to scrutiny. So he appointed a committee of churchmen, none of whom could read Hebrew or Aramaic. Yeah, it was all handwritten, of course. This is, to appreciate the magnitude of the catastrophe. Remember, this was 200 years before the invention of the printing press. Every one of those manuscripts had to be written by hand. Would take weeks or months just to write one volume of the Talmud. And what about the commentaries? And to say they were priceless really is an understatement. Today, if you come across one of these for auction at Sotheby's, you could buy it for $10,000 or more, depending on what it is. And we're talking here ultimately about hundreds, maybe thousands of manuscripts. But it's not just a matter of the monetary value, what a collector is going to pay for it when he's bidding at Sotheby's. The point here is that this is the lifeblood of the Jewish people. And this was the great repository of the wisdom of the Balei Tosafot. And the churchmen, therefore, took some of these manuscripts and they started poring over them. You know, how much they could understand is very doubtful. But of course, they had their mate Nicholas Donin on their side, who understood a bit, and they probably forced some other Rabbanim or others to read and to translate for them. And Donin tipped them off as to the passages they were looking for. And they decided to they reached the conclusion that Talmud is indeed fraught with heresy, and it needs to be condemned. The Jewish community did not take it lying down, and they immediately appealed to the king and appealed to any friends that they could find. And it's very interesting that it seems that the Bishop of Shantz was more sympathetic towards the Jews. Now, his critics claim that he was bribed. We don't know exactly, but if you've heard of the Tosfos Shantz, Rashmi Shantz, Rishimshon Shantz, it was a great center of Torah study at that time. And the bishop, in those days, I wrote down his name, but I can't pronounce it in French, so rather than embarrass myself, we'll just call him the Bishop of Shantz. And he interceded on behalf of the Jews. And he was able to persuade young King Louis that he's taking the matter too far, and the Talmud is really not so bad as it seems to be, and he should allow the Jews to continue their study. And King Louis agreed to change his mind. But apparently on one of the occasions when the bishop was sort of petitioning him, the bishop was overcome with some kind of terrible stomach cramps, and apparently he died on the spot. And King Louis fled, thinking it may have been contagious, and this was seen by the Christians as a great omen min hashamayim, that it was a terrible thing that this bishop was up to, and he got his punishment. In fact, this fascinating book, anyone who's interested in the medieval Jewish history, this is one of the handbooks. I'm sure Ezra has seen this book many times, probably read it a few times. The Jew in the Medieval World by Jacob Rader Marcus. When I was in university, once upon a time, it was a handbook. I think it still is a handbook. Fascinating original documents, translated all into English from the original languages. And you have here some letters that were written about this event, and that's the main source that we have for it. You can just pass that around if you'd like to see it. So a disputation was scheduled in 1240 in Paris. It's the Hebrew year 5000. Easy to remember, 5000 in the Hebrew calendar. There were 4 rabbis who were there to defend the Talmud, of whom the greatest, the one that was the leader of the group, was Rabbi Yechilmi Paris. He also was assisted by Rav Moshe of Kutsi, who wrote the Smag, Rav Moshe ben Yaakov Mikutsi, the author of the Smag, a very important halachic compendium. And Rabbi Yechilmi Paris attempted to defend the Talmud with great courage and dignity, but of course it was all for naught. It was all, the outcome was predetermined. In fact, it wasn't even a disputation. It wasn't really a dialogue between Nicholas Donin and Rabbi Yechilmi Paris. It was really more a question of seeking to defend the Talmud. It was a matter of the allegations that were brought up, and he was just given the opportunity to try to explain away as best he could the various passages. So he defended the reasonableness of Talmudic passages. He demonstrated that Scripture itself contains assertions similar to those mocked by Donin. He pointed to the willful distortions of the Talmudic statement that allegedly encouraged the killing of Gentiles. Now, this is one of the most explosive proof texts that Donin adduced to show how the Talmud is full of nasty and misanthropic ideas. And if you want to turn to the other page that I've given you, it's actually the last section, that's source number 6. We're kind of going backwards here. It says, if you look at the little headline of that short excerpt, Tov sheben chashim retzotz es mocho, Tov shebemitzrim harog. The best of the serpents smash its head, and the best of the Egyptians should be killed. Now, just very briefly, Rashi actually mentions this as well, Rashi and Chumash. The Torah says that Paro took 600 of his choice riders and horses and chariots in order to pursue the Jewish people when they had left Mitzrayim, and he caught up to them on Yam Suf, and they all perished in the waters of the sea, as is very well known. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I saw recently some links from a friend of mine showing that in the Muslim world today there are Muslims who are attacking Judaism based on what they claim are quotes from the Talmud.
Oh yeah, I'm not surprised. As I said, you can find it on the internet. There's no shortage of them. And then maybe the Egyptians don't like this passage as well for particular reasons. But Rashi says it's misquoted. Yeah, yeah. Okay, was it? That's right. Well, that's what Rabbi Paris said. The Gemara doesn't say Misbacham, the Masechta Sofrim says. We'll get to it in one moment. So Rashi asks, where did they come from? Where did they get these horses from even? Because it says already at the end of the previous parsha that the hail brought about the death of all the livestock, except Hayareis Dvar Hashem, the one who fears God, he'll bring his livestock indoors, so they won't be clobbered by the hail. So says Rashi, it must be that the horses were of those who feared God, and that's why they survived. So from there we see, says Rashi, that even the best of the Mitzrim are destined for a watery grave, because these were the best of them, the ones who feared God. So there are different versions of this statement. And in some places it says, Tov shebegoyim harog, the best of the Gentiles should be killed. So if you take a look at this passage, this is taken from a very interesting little essay, a short essay in a book called Torah Shlema by Menachem Mendel Kasher. And it's a fascinating book. We don't have time to talk about it now. And he deals with our subject. So let's just look briefly at it. We don't have too much time. Soni Yisrael me'azim kedem ad yameinu anu. The enemies of Israel from earliest times until today, when they want to condemn the Jewish people and to arouse hatred of the nations of the world against us, so they quote this passage which says, Tov shebegoyim harog, that it says in the Talmud, the best of the Gentiles should be killed. So he says these kinds of people, this is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kasher, right? So these kinds of people, you can't remonstrate with them. They're not looking for analysis, for assessment, for evaluation. They're only looking for an excuse for anti-Semitism. He says, we've got nothing to say to them. But there are others who really want to know. And he says those people have a legitimate inquiry. What does it mean? So continue where it says letter base to the left there. 700 years ago, b'vikucho shel Rabbeinu Yechiel miParis, im hamuma Nicholas Donin, b'shana hei alafim, in the year 5000, nish'al al ma'amar zeh, this passage was questioned. Uviru al pi Masechta Sofrim, and Yechiel miParis explained that according to what it says in Masechta Sofrim, shemedaber b'shas milchama, it's talking at a time of war. At the time of war, you don't have a chance to say, well, the person who's firing at me with his submachine gun, is he an ethical person? Is he honest in his dealings with his fellow man? Does he pay his taxes in timely fashion? You don't have time to enter into those kinds of contemplation because he's shooting to kill you. Therefore, you've got to kill him. So that's the one approach, and that's what Yechiel miParis said. It's only talking about a time of war, a time of battle. So in the time of battle, then you've got to act in self-defense. And then he goes on to say, which I don't know whether that's the real meaning or if it's just apologetics. I don't know. But Rabbi Kasher goes on to say as follows, and he has a lot more to say, but I've only quoted this part here. We won't read it even at length. You're welcome to read it at your leisure, but I'll just explain to you what he says. He said anybody who knows Hebrew and anyone who's familiar with the style of the sages realizes that this statement is not meant to be taken at face value. That the best of the Gentiles, you should kill them. It's ridiculous. He says it's the same statement that says, it's the same style that says, Tov, do you have any doctors here? Tov, oh we do, Fabian. Tov sheberofim legehenom. The best of the doctors are destined for purgatory. Obviously it doesn't mean, it's a way of saying that a doctor has life and death in his hands, and if he doesn't or she doesn't act with complete dedication and expertise, then tragedy can ensue, and maybe that person is not as careful as she should be, or he should be. And it says also, a tov she, it says in the third, it says, Ksheira shebenashim ba'alas keshafim. The best of the women are sorceresses. I mean, obviously it doesn't mean, you're going to say, what's her name, Batsheva Kanievsky's Zichrona Tzaddikas Levracha was a sorcerer. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, the best of the women, the most worthy of them, it's ridiculous. It's a way, it's just a figure of speech. It's a way of saying that at a certain time and place, women were prone to superstitious beliefs and to sorcery, and similarly the statement here. But he goes on to say, and I just can't resist because we are remembering Jewish tragedies at this season of the year. He wrote this during the Holocaust years. It was published in 1944. He must have written it in 1942, 1943, in the depths of the Holocaust. He was in New York at that time, and he wrote this essay, and he interprets it in his own way. He says it's mentioned in the context of the best of it's a Toshib and a Chashim, the best of the vipers, of the serpents, crush its head. And he says in that sense it is meant. Someone who comes across a serpent, and here in England we don't have any venomous serpents, but in Africa, in many places they do, and if you come across a serpent and it looks, like a little thing, you can't see it, it hardly pokes its head above the ground, you think, well, it's a very friendly kind of creature, can't do any harm to anyone. And of course it can be venomous, it can kill a person in a heartbeat. If you crush its head, then you'll be doing a favor to everybody in the area. He says about the Nazis, and he's alluding to Hitler himself. He says if somebody had realized what a viper he is, if somebody had knocked him off, when he was chanting to the thugs in the beer halls of Munich, in the 1920s, if somebody had knocked him off right then, what a favor it would have been for all mankind. Okay, that's just as an aside. I've already digressed slightly. Let's finish up our story, though, because it's almost time for Mariv. So this is how Yechimi Paris responded to that. In letter D, maintain the need for a work that would clarify the legal code of the Bible. Now this is obvious, I think, to everyone in this room. If you open up the Chumash, Parshas Mishpatim, for example, where you see the laws to regulate a Jewish society which is ethical, which is moral, which is in keeping with the rule of law, and there are many mitzvahs there about establishing courts of law and all of that. But it is not in any way adequate by itself to deal with all of the scenarios in a human society for all time. It's compressed into such a small number of verses that it's completely inadequate on its own. So this Yechimi Paris explained that you must have a work to clarify the legal code of the Bible. The Talmud is that work. He insisted that the pagans of the Talmud were legally distinct from contemporary Christians. Now, here, a certain amount of apologetics and a certain amount of, no doubt this is absolutely true. Many of the references to Gentiles in the Talmud refer to pagans, to idolaters who were completely degenerate and who were vicious and were bloodthirsty and would carry out child sacrifice and human sacrifice and all sorts of theologically degenerate behavior. And the Christians of medieval Europe were probably, in many ways, not the same as those ancient pagans. On the other hand, there are probably many other references in the Talmud that do not distinguish between pagans or Christians or Muslims or whoever it may be. But I will tell you, anyone who has studied the Talmud or even cracked open the Chumash with Rashi and done a bit of learning will come across the expression akum. It's an abbreviation, Ayin Chaf Vav Mem, Akum. It stands for Oved Kochavim Umazalos. And this is a legacy of the censor and a legacy of this debate. Because every time it says Goy, which just means a nation, or Nachri, which means a Gentile, or similar expressions, the censor has forced us, and sometimes it's self-censorship, because why should we look for trouble? So we just say of our own Akum, Oved Kochavim Umazalos. It means someone who worships stars and constellations. In other words, it's a reference to the ancient heathens that doesn't necessarily apply to the people nowadays. And by so doing, he was able to deflect any criticism of the Talmud by saying that the Talmud is condemning, the good Christian folk of contemporary France. And he said, no, it's a reference to the ancient star worshippers and those who worship constellations. Letter F claimed that Jesus occasionally mentioned by the Talmud lived before the Christian Jesus, and consequently had nothing to do with the founder of Christianity. Now, most of those passages you will not find in the Talmud Bavli today, because they were so contentious that the censor, I'll just pass this book around as well, it's nearly time for Marv, but this is a book called The Censorship of Hebrew Books. And there are a number, if you just flip through the pages, you can see a number of examples of Hebrew books that have been censored, have been subject to the attention of the censor, where objectionable passages have simply been blacked out. And therefore, you can hardly find a reference to Yeshu HaNotzri in the Talmud the way it is readily available today. But there's a book called Chisonos Hashas. Ezra can find it for you in the Jews College Library, I'm sure, Chisonos Hashas. And there you will find many stories of Jesus. Most of them are not that complimentary, I'm sorry to say. Rabbi Chimi Paris said, no, it doesn't mean the Christian Jesus, it refers to somebody else, Kama Yosef Ika Bashuka. There are a lot of people by that name, Jesus is quite a common name, and therefore it meant somebody else. And say, yeah, well, what about Jesus from Nazareth? So he says, well, it's like saying, Louis of Paris. He said, a lot of people in Paris by that name. So he said, it doesn't really mean that. Whether it really did or didn't, difficult to know. This was his courageous attempt. It didn't work all that well. Just to finish up, the burning of the Talmud happened on the 6th of Tammuz. That means about 2 weeks ago in the calendar, less than that, 1242. It was Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas. And here we don't have time to read it, but I encourage you to read it at your leisure here on this page. It is source number 3. Look at sources 2 and 3. And because it was Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas, they proclaimed a fast for tzaddikim, which many people observed for hundreds of years on Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas. It still is on the statute books. It's not an obligatory fast, but you can find it in this book, which is the Luach Eretz Yisrael. It mentions that there are those who fast on Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas because it says in Parshas Chukas, Zos Chukas HaTorah. And they said that one of the Rishonim, in a dream, it was revealed to him, Da Gezeras Oraisa. This is the Gezerah, this is the decree of heaven against the Talmud. And on that day, 24 cartloads of the Talmud and other manuscripts were burned, put to the flame, no doubt thousands of manuscripts. It was opposite the Notre Dame Cathedral. And that's why in our publicity, for those who saw, we put Notre Dame over here, if you're wondering what it's doing there, because according to the accounts, it happened right outside Notre Dame Cathedral. And Rav Meir of Rottenburg, who became the future captive rabbi, whose story we'll tell on another occasion, he wrote a moving elegy, which we say on source number 1. I don't know why they're exactly in reverse order here, but source number 1, Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh, and on Tisha B'Av, 3 weeks from today, we will be reciting that elegy among the keynotes that we recite. He was an eyewitness to those tragic events, and he composed an elegy about the destruction of the manuscripts of the Talmud. And in terms of the effect, so the effect basically was it meant the end of the greatness of Torah Jewry in France. It struggled along for another 60 years till Philip the Fair expelled them, and then he let them back a while later, but France never again recovered its eminence in Torah study. Rabbi Paris himself survived the trauma. He actually went to Akko and he founded a yeshiva there in Akko. The lessons, this is seen as a rebuke for the denunciation of the philosophical writings of Maimonides. And this is why I was drawing attention to the question of the anthropomorphisms. Because, again, in the source material, in source number 5, you have a fascinating statement. Rabbi Hilami Verona, he was from Italy, and he is the one who's our main source for these events. And he says how, well, if you think about the history, you look back just a few years before, and you will recall that the controversy over the writings of the Rambam also took a similar sort of sequence of events in which the critics of the Rambam, who said he's too philosophical, we don't understand it, we don't agree with it, maybe he himself is influenced by heretical philosophical ideas, don't read the writings of the Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim, Sefer Hamada, and they denounced it to the Christian authorities. And you know what? The Christians were only too happy to say, oh, quite right, this is heresy. And they seized the manuscripts and they consigned them to the flames. And it happened outside of Notre Dame. According to legend, it was lit with a taper from the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and with that they put the writings of the Rambam to the flames. Says Hillel of Verona, it was in the same place years later, that the Talmud was burned and that Jewish life, intellectual life in France was dealt a death blow. But I want to end on a favorable note and then we'll daven. There is an epilogue here. There's a man in New York called Rabbi Nassim David Rabinowitz. He's an interesting man. He's a Talmud Chacham. He's a historian. He's a slight maverick, but he's an interesting man. And he wrote an essay on our subject, and I want to share with you the last lines of his essay. However, the Jewish people have their sweet revenge. I was recently delivering shiurim in Basel, Switzerland, and was invited to visit a thriving Jewish community and successful yeshiva called Or HaTalmud, that's the French spelling, right over the border in France between Mulhouse and Basel. That town is called Saint Louis, and its patron is King Louis IX. The beautiful sounds of Talmud study reverberate daily through this little town. Once again, Hashem has kept his promise. On Israel Chai. Thank you.